For those of you who don't know, I'm Gwen Young, and I'm the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project here at the Wilson Center. And on behalf of the Wilson Center, myself, and our Latin America program headed by Cynthia Arnson and Eric Olson, we'd like to welcome you today to a discussion on evidence-based policy approaches for preventing interfamily violence and reducing criminal behavior in Latin America. This event is presenting a series of studies commissioned by the Wilson Center and supported by the Inter-American Development Bank on intrafamily violence in Latin America and new approaches to dealing with this problem. Violence against women is not only a public health problem and an international development challenge, but it's also linked directly to local, national, and international security issues of violence and conflict. Interfamily violence affects 14 to 38% of women throughout their life in Latin America. In Peru, the rates of violence against women are greatest among recent Spanish speakers, those who grew up speaking an indigenous language but now speak Spanish. These women are 9.4% more likely to experience violence than women who have spoken Spanish since childhood. And we're going to explore and discuss why this is. In analyzing the link to criminal activity, this study have found that in 47% of cases surveyed, incarcerated women and men have been direct victims of household violence during childhood. And yet men and women experience violence differently. Boys experience more direct violence, while girls experience more indirect violence. But nearly half of the women incarcerated for criminal behavior have experienced direct or indirect intrafamily violence at the home, nearly half. And further, women incarcerated are 38% more likely to be incarcerated for nonviolent crimes. So not only do they experience violence differently, but their incarcerated life is experiencing differently. And this finding highlights the importance of a gender-differentiated approach to dealing with violence. So the policy solutions that we're going to discuss today need to consider the importance of early intervention for addressing interfamily violence and a gender-differentiated approach, better targeting of government programs to support survivors and reduce the long-term impact of interfamily violence, and better organized access to government service, including access to not only prosecutors in the legal system, healthcare, counseling service, support systems. Studies and reality show that addressing interfamily violence is not only important for those girls and boys who experience it, but can have long-term benefits for the community and society by lessening criminal behavior later in life. So today, the panelists will discuss the findings of 5 papers commissioned by the Wilson Center with the support of the IADB. We would like to thank the Inter-American Development Bank for their partnership with the Latin America program and their support of this project. Specifically, I would like to thank Ana Maria Rodriguez-Ortiz, who is the Manager of Institutions for Development Department at the IADB, Natalie Alvarado-Rener, the Citizen Security Lead Specialist at the IADB, and Carlos Santiso, the Division Director in Innovation for Citizen Services at the IADB. Further, we would like to acknowledge Erika Ender, a renowned Panamanian singer and songwriter, co-author of the 2017 hit Despacito. My son is very excited that you're here today, and she will deliver the keynote today. So I will now turn the podium over to Carlos Santiso, who in addition to being the Division Director for Citizen Services, has a long career working on improving lives in fragile states and emerging economies in Africa and the Americas by furthering democracy, strengthening governance, and fighting corruption. He has experiences working with the African Development Bank as well as other institutions. Carlos, I'm going to turn the mic over to you, and we look forward to an engaging discussion. Welcome to the Wilson Center.
No, thank you, Gwen, and y buenos días a todo el mundo.
Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Inter-American Development Bank, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion, which is very important to us. It's also part of a partnership with the Woodrow Wilson Center on these issues, and we'd like to thank our partners for having the chance to raise the profile of the discussion on this topic. Also, we'd like to thank our panelists, Jorge Aguero, Ana Sakhanov, Eric Olson, who are going to share with us the main findings and main conclusions of the studies that we've conducted together with the Woodrow Wilson Center on this scourge of violence against women and domestic violence. And we're going to show the effort of the bank to support knowledge generation on this issue and the type of violence which often is silent because it's not reported. And at the IDB, we're very committed and very concerned and troubled about these issues. And Latin America stands out for many reasons, but also for a high domestic violence rate, which is much higher than what it should be and higher than many other regions. And so at the bank, we're working to see what innovative solutions we can put into place together with the governments of the region to get to the roots of not only the symptoms of this problem, but there's regions that we're supporting many countries in the region with regard to citizen security and the judiciaries, where the issue to deal with crimes against women is something that we're emphasizing quite a bit in different ways. Just to share some of the lines of work we're following. The first one that we believe is important is to improve quality of information and data, statistics about this phenomenon. And generally speaking, we have criminal statistics that are very complicated in the region, but in this type of crime, they're even more of a challenge and complicating. What are the trends? What is the path that this type of crime has followed? So at the bank, we view it very important to improve the quality of information and statistics and data with regard to this issue, to be able to deal with and address what's going on and design interventions that could focus on the key areas, the Gordian knots of this issue. So we're also working to support pilot projects and more rigorous impact programs, and to figure out what works and what doesn't. In this area, as well as others, we have to be much more rigorous in designing interventions and look at how we can approach and look at different challenges or causes to explain this type of crime. I'd like to underscore a few of the specific projects that we're working on. We're working, for example, with the government of Honduras to reform the police force, but also to prevent femicides is a term that's very important. Is that more and more women are now being included in the police, so there's a different relationship between police and citizens as far as intelligence and reaching out to the population, particularly to women. In Chile, we're also working on a pilot project within Banco de Nación, which is about micro enterprises with women in conflict with the law. Women in incarcerated women is also a very big problem throughout the region, so that what we're trying to do is support these women, incarcerated women, so that when they've finished serving their sentence, they have the tools available to them to be able to help their families. In Colombia, we're also supporting participation of women in high-level leadership positions, not only in public security, but in the peace process. We have a view so that women's perspective is introduced into this. I also want to, the last point I want to underscore, which I think is very important, is that violence against women and the eradication thereof is not just an exclusive about women. I think it's super important to be able to talk about violence of male chauvinistic or machista violence, because the machista behavior of men, the male chauvinist way, and based on archaic values, is what fuels this violence. And we as men have to also get involved and become committed and change the values that lead to this type of behavior. And thus, we must work quite hard and that's what we're doing at the bank, work together with men with regard to social values, which explain and these prevalence of machista values that leads to this. And so that's what we're working hard at. We're also working hard on it. So it's not just a women's problem. It's a challenge that also in the end, it's a problem of we as men must also address. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce and welcome to the Inter-American, from the Inter-American Development Bank, and I have the privilege to introduce Erica Ender to you. And as been said, everybody knows her and the song Despacito, but I believe Erica is going to help us here to share her own experience and her knowledge and skills and the multiple talents that has to do with her commitment to several different philanthropic causes she is devoted to through her Puertas Abiertas Foundation, Open Door Foundation. She works with kids and teenagers in Panama using music, the integrity of the individual, education, civic awareness to build civic capital up to create these values in our society. She also plays an important value at critical forums on this, such as the Summit of the Social Goods of the United Nations, or the World Women's Forum as well. So beyond this, she's a Latina and cultural ambassador. She's very committed to these issues, and it's a pleasure and an honor to have her here with us to share with us and add to this discussion about how to build up civic capital in our societies. Without further ado, thank you very much, and I give Erica the floor right now. Good morning. I'm going to give myself a timer. I need a timer because I'm a horrible speaking. They tell me that if I say 15 minutes, it's 3 hours, so it's tough for me. So this is an extensive topic to be able to talk about in 15 minutes because I'm one of the people that said it's what use is it to cut off a rotten branch if you don't get to the root of the problem. So what I'm mainly going to talk about from my humble point of view and as the way I view society and what my personal experiences have been both as a woman as well as a professional in a world, the world I move in, which is mainly led by males, went men. So if we get to the root of it, we have to take into account that almost every one of us come from the womb of our mothers. It's a blessing, and we're all a work of art made by the woman, and together with whoever our father is. The thing is, what happens is, especially in Latina culture, is that we women ourselves, we tend to fuel machismo and or create or raise with machismo our males. So we can't judge them because a lot of times we're feeding them. We make their bed for them. We feed them. We cook for them. So we're fueling a lot of things. We're wrong because society has taught us to raise them in this way, and so that's not an excuse because it's difficult things have come up in entire generations. And violence against women is latent, and I use my music and my art to call attention to all of this. There's part of the lyrics of a song speaks about this. It says, for example, Marta was going home and she found a knife in their skin, and then she washes it. And so, on the first page, we see all these deaths. And it makes these famous, and there's a lot of, but there's many cases we never hear about. There's some of them. So there's not only in the news, this bad news we're always seeing in the movies. So we view it as just a normal thing, and so that's why I want to thank the bank, Carlos, and everybody who's taken this initiative for those social responsibility they've taken on because we all live on the planet Earth, which is our home, and we're one race, which is the human race, and we have to have empathy, self-esteem, particularly to know what we're worth and respect that we owe ourselves and the dignity we owe to ourselves, but at the same time, empathy. And we must respect and fear for our sisters and brothers on the planet Earth. I was lucky to be raised in a multicultural home, which taught me that the world is a single home, as I said. But it also it inculcated solid values in me that Carlos was just mentioning about the archaic values that exist. I'm talking mainly about ethics and the basic ethics and morals that children are born with. The children are teachers, and they teach parents about the simple things, and that there shouldn't be discrimination, that we are joyous by nature, and that we have to be compassionate. And so, but society intoxicates us, and it affects us. And then with children, we have so many dreams we want to make true, but a lot of times they get cut off because of what other people say or what's dictated by society. In my case, as a woman, it's very tough to have this mission in life, and I was lucky to have parents, as I was telling you, that inculcated these basic values, to have self-esteem, and I believe that's very important, that adults, based on as an adult, based on the self-esteem that a children has, but it's not free. All along the way, if you want something, do you deserve it? What did you do to deserve that? And so I was used to that. Everything as a ward, there had to be an effort and sacrifice and perseverance and work behind it. And throughout my life as an adult, that everything I've attained has been on the basis of those values. Additionally, obviously, I had the opportunity, and that's why they were inculcating and sowing, planting the seeds to view myself as something else. Because when you're there, you in a place, and they tell you got to get married by a certain age, you have to have such and such a type of boyfriend, and do this, do that. You have to stay home. I'm talking about of our generation, because now it's different, of course. But what happened when I was very, very young, I sort of overcame certain challenges, and I showed myself that to get anywhere, I had to have a strong personality. But I knew what I wanted, and it wasn't necessarily being feminine. But I knew what I wanted. I said, I love it when you sing, but here at home, my mother said, and at family gatherings, but I don't like that other people see you. And so that's what I said. Can you guess what my mother said when that was said? And said, thank you for the time we've spent together, but the truth is, I don't believe that you're good for me in my life. And goes, because my mission was to communicate through art, and I'm not going to let any man. This was a boyfriend who told me that no man was going to dictate such a thing. And I cried for 3 or 4 days, but he's out next. And so that's one of the things that happened to you along the way. But professionally, what happened was, many men and colleagues who I love a lot, who have become brothers. I owe my career to men, because it's a career of men, and most of the artists that I've recorded with are men, and my co-authors, mostly the composers or songwriters, are men. So I've learned to be a partner and to get results and to share, not compete. But along the way, there are people who are at a place, and that when they see us and we're in our heels, and all of a sudden they start thinking that I don't know, we're easy prey. And as a lot of people are starting to report. And so I had a production that was so spectacular. It was about December, and a person comes into the record company, and my producer brings the material in and says, look, listen to what Erica's doing. It's fabulous. And then he answers, of course I want to listen to Erica, but first I want to see her sitting right in front of me here.
And obviously my producer put him in his place, and I did as well. And with great class, in just a few words, I said, yeah, of course you'll hear me, but you're going to hear me on the radio. So these are things that you have to deal with as time goes on. Another thing having to do with machismo and lack of vision, this happened to me in my career at first as a composer. I don't want to judge per se, but I do think that there was a lack of vision. And what am I referring to when I say vision? What is not the habit, what is not the custom? For example, I would send a song that I would sing to a male, or to the repertoire department of the record companies, who would choose the songs for records. And it was said Eric Enders, so the demo was my voice. Then I was called in to say, those who were so polite as to be able to call, and they said, your song is very nice, but it sounds very feminine to me. And since we need to figure out how to jump over walls and can make holes in walls to get to the other side, well, I had, instead of attacking, I would figure out a creative way to get past that barrier. So I began to ask my male colleagues to please do me the favor of singing my songs, and I sent the first ones in as E-enders without spelling out my first name, and they began to play. So I'm not so discreet with my hairstyle and so forth, and I would come in and say, it's me. And that's where I began to get results showing not only can men write for women, but women can also write songs for men. It's a question of understanding, of figuring out how to have empathy. When I write a song, I'm not just thinking about entertaining. I'm thinking that I'm doing the soundtrack for other people's lives, because music has that power. It reaches millions and millions of people, and it marks certain times of their lives. Who of us who's here has not had some song in our history, one or many? How many people don't hear a song and it reminds them of some past love or a particular time or a smell or a time when they were happy or when they went through a sad moment? Or how many times do you hear a song and it really makes you think and makes you become more conscientious about certain things that are going on? So I feel that the duty should be above all else. We all have our own talents, that talent has to be used for a common good, because anything that is done for oneself doesn't leave a legacy for anyone else, and it's very important that we bear this in mind. Now, how did I make a name for myself in the Latin music industry being a woman? This is what many people have asked me. Well, trying to be as authentic as possible all the time, trying to seek empathy and to touch hearts along the way, but showing firm results within my professionalism, winning things with values, with ethics, with talent, with effort, with credibility, and what I always say, abilities or capabilities. It's very complicated for a man, and I say a man specifically, because in the industry, that's what I have to deal with. If a man has been raised in such a way that he sees a woman as someone who has to stay at home or doing the housework or should earn less money, it's very difficult to be able to convince them that we actually have the same rights. They might come to see us as a threat, and that's happened to me, and it's happened in relationships as well, that it becomes Mr. Ender. So if the man isn't very self-secure, then it's very difficult to have a woman wearing pants next to him. And so what I always say is there's a very fine line between feminism and femininity. I am a woman who has put on the pants to go forward in the world in general, not just in terms of my career, but at the same time, if a feminine woman, I am a feminine woman, and I don't think that feminism should be always ready to fight, to stand out as fighting machismo, and that's it. I think feminism should be that we can work for our rights, for equity, for equal pay for equal work. And if we have a greater capacity, well, we should be paid what we're worth. If we're going to go back to the days of the caveman, of course, the men would go out in clemency to hunt, because that's the nature of the man, and the women would stay in carrying the kids, so that humankind might go forward. Now, today, we don't have to go fight bears or any other animals out there. So the world has evolved in such a way that we can all go out in search of our dreams. Now, what happens with this sort of feminism? Well, quality time with kids at home has been lost somewhat, because over time, or most of the time, it is the women who bear more of the weight of work at home and the values at home. Some men are responsible, and many are not. And there are many mothers today, and in previous generations as well, who go out into the street to fight to bring the bread home, but also who make time for their kids. I am the daughter of two physicians who was very busy, but I never felt that there was lack of quality time for myself. And they inculcated those values into me within the little bit of time that we had to share, which was at dinner time. And my mother, who every Monday at 8 p.m. would give us life lessons, looking at the positive side of everything and inculcating us with that. What you deserve, what should you do for the world to understand you? How can you reach people's hearts and do things in the best possible way? So this is something that we also need to be conscious of today when we are raising the new women and the new men. Raise the children not with this generation of the more girls you have, the more of a man you are, but rather, well, if we go to the root, I think everything can change and be changed. I also believe in responsibility. I have a career that spans more than 25 years where I've had the opportunity to have many accomplishments, to have won almost all the awards of the industry, to have gone into the Hall of Fame of Latin composers at age 42, whereas colleagues such as of mine, like Camilo Sesto, have come in at age 80 because I began my career very young. I've taped some 200 records, sometimes as composers, but I've worked in all of the markets. And Despacito has been like a cherry at the top of the cake for all of those involved, and it went around the world, the whole world. And I had the joy, to a certain point, of being the only woman involved in that process. And I say the joy because I had a spotlight, and I continue to have a spotlight on what a woman can accomplish when she believes in her dreams. And what I tried to do is to take that with the greatest possible responsibility and empower other people instead of seeing it from far. See it from the standpoint of a girl who might be at home with dreams, as I was. I had so many dreams when I would see Gloria Estefan and playing conga and so forth. And I said, when I grow up, I want people to sing my music. And it happened in Spanish. So what's the message? Everything is possible with the right values, with the right attitude, with work, effort, self-respect, putting yourself in your own place and making sure and upholding yourself with humility, but with dignity. That makes all the difference. So that ability to tell people, I'm a regular human being with flesh and bones who had dreams, worked for, and that I accomplished. So no woman should feel that she has to stay enclosed or that her dreams are not worthwhile. To the contrary, in my case, it was possible. If I can, anyone can. It's a question of working for it. Anything can be possible. I think it's also important throughout the mission that we're carrying out to put one's heart into it so as to leave a legacy. As Carlos was saying, I work through a foundation which is called Puertas Abiertas, Open Doors, in my country, where I began to work to eradicate child labor, holding workshops throughout the country. And today there's a festival called Talent with Purpose, which is how I was raised, to use my talent for a purpose. We work nationwide with all of the schools so that children can come in and participate in different categories of the arts, and once they're participating, automatically their schools join, so as to create that sense of belonging. And along the way, those kids do tasks that we give them, whereas their main participant, through their talent, well, they'll get a score for their talent, but also additional score for how their talent contributed to the community. So we fix a couple of schools per year in vulnerable communities, benefiting 12,000 kids. And the kids who help fix those other schools also receive improvements in their own schools. All of the kids who win in their category end up with a complete scholarship in Panama or abroad, full paid university education. And this is a way to continue to try to get people to change the chip so that we understand that everything we have in this life has to have a purpose and that we have to activate ourselves so everyone else can be activated. Not just point to the government or point to other persons. My milieu is better if I am better, if my home is better, if my community is better, and at the same time empower new girls, new women, to be able to follow their dreams and to work in life without losing sight of their home and their personal aspect. So I want to bid farewell by simply saying that I think that everything is possible. We can all make mistakes, but we can all remake ourselves. I have a program that I'd love to share with you about reconstruction of human beings who have been punished with imprisonment, and then they're let out into the let back out and have no future. That even their families say that, and these persons are often unfairly in prison, or in prison because they defended themselves, or for crimes they never committed, yet they need to serve a sentence. I've seen this very close up, and I'm very close to that cause, and if I can help in any way, I'd be delighted to. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, I think everything is possible, and my 15 minutes have run up, and with my philosophy, I like to share everything that that I've learned in life. And if you follow me at Erica Ender, then, well, I continue to share so many lessons. I want to say the following. Woman is not just one who uses high heels, but one who takes a firm step in life. Not just one who has curves, but one who knows how to maintain, control with all the ups and downs along the way. It's not just one who makes herself up very nicely, but one who cultivates oneself and lays bare one's soul in the world. Not one who just can take from the world, but can set the best example. Not just the lover or the friend, but the companion for life. Not just one who works for what they want, but one who does so with love, vocation, and responsibility. Not just one who appears to be a princess, but the warrior who becomes the queen of her own story. Thank you.
Bueno, qué buenas palabras, qué
Such nice words and such excellent testimony from Erika. We're going to talk and develop several of these points on this interesting topic, such as values, such as educating men going forward on how to treat women, self-esteem. But to continue this second part of the discussion, I'm going to invite our panelists to step forward to come up to the stage and begin to address various issues. I'm going to explain who each of our experts are. Jorge Agüero is an assistant professor in economics and Latin American studies at the University of Connecticut. Also, Eric Olson, deputy director of Wilson Center's Latin American program. Ana Safranov is a researcher at the Center for Latin American Studies on insecurity and violence, this at the Universidad 3 de Febrero. And Carelia Villa, who is a senior citizen security specialist in modernization at the Inter-American Development Bank. So we're going to move on to this next round of the debate, and those who are following us through social networks and through our live signal could also leave your questions and comments in Twitter accounts of the Wilson Center, which is at Latin American Prog, and also hashtags of Equidad Total and Wilson This Morning. So we can now get started. I'd like to begin so as to have a dialogue with our experts, picking up on some of the ideas that Erika has left us with. Very interesting, and one of these is the importance of educating men and boys about how to treat women going forward, and sharing different models, ideas of family models. I'd like to ask Eric, how important is this issue, particularly for seeing on a broader spectrum how all this impacts on violence against women and the importance of the general social context? Good morning. Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you, Diana. I was thinking quite a bit when Erika was talking about these issues. Normally, as a researcher, and what we're going to talk about in just a moment, we think a lot about public policies and how the state can respond and work more to prevent such incidents and to support the survivors of these problems. But I think that what Erika has said just now, it's also very important that one look to the context of the family situation. This is extremely important for avoiding, preventing such problems, and in one way or another, to get kids off to a healthier start in life. The response cannot come exclusively from the state. It also needs to come from the home. Obviously, there are things that the state can do to support families, but also construct values, ideas, concepts that are broader and that go further in the community regarding gender roles and concepts of masculinity, femininity. That, too, has to come from the family. It's very important. Now, Carelia, of all the issues that Erika mentioned, I know how difficult it is for a woman to make headway in industries that are male-dominated. Now, you at the bank work on different aspects and on different projects, but how important is it for this discussion that spaces open up for women and that they be significant so they can have not such a difficult path ahead in developing their professional capabilities? Very well. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this forum. I think that, in effect, women still face different barriers in order to go forward in different parts of the labor market. I have the good fortune of representing one of these complicated spaces. We work on issues of citizen security and justice in various countries of the Latin American Caribbean region. And because of being a woman, sometimes there are difficulties in this work. Our philosophy, as Erica has said, is, well, we very much value the ability of a person independent of their gender. We believe that if a person has a contribution to make, then we should open up space for women to work more and more on this issue. We're convinced that as women, there's also greater empathy for the topic of violence against women. In our bank, we have a major leader on this issue, beginning, well, obviously, with our vice president and also our department manager, Ana Maria Rodriguez. And within our division as well, there is a woman who is heading up this work on this issue, Natalia Alvarado. So little by little, there are more spaces, more opportunities opening up for women to work on complex issues. And as I was saying, there's a very important issue. The issue of violence against women requires that empathy, that understanding, and obviously also maintaining gender balance. It's always important to work with our male colleagues as well, who make huge contributions on these issues, and which enables us to have such a balance within our institution and on the issues that we work on. Now, as there are so many different aspects to this issue, the Wilson Center has taken on a number of academic studies that will try to explore in depth different aspects of this issue that which also becomes an obstacle to economic development in Latin America, and which affects other aspects in collaboration with, well, this was done with the Inter-American Development Bank. So initially, we're going to look at the situation of women in prisons in Latin America, and we're also going to talk about how violence against women is transmitted intergenerationally. A broad panorama of family violence being experienced by women who are part of indigenous minorities in countries such as Peru. And we're also going to discuss those policies and the lights that are being cast to figure out how and why this dynamic of violence against women continues to be reproduced in the region. So beginning with the first issue, which is women in confinement or locked up in Latin America, we generally understand that most of the population of prisons is made up of men, but in Latin America, there's been a considerable increase of women in prisons in recent years. And to discuss this issue and to explain a bit more and cast some light on this, I'm going to give the floor to Ana Safranov. Ana? Very well. I'm going to begin my presentation in the context of this examination, which was triggered by there being so little knowledge of women in prison in Latin America. Women have been forgotten in prison. Women who are in prison have been forgotten, not just in Latin America. As a result of this, public policies focused specifically on women are few and far between as regards prevention of criminal conduct, as well as for social reinsertion once women get out of prison. Moreover, the prison conditions for women are inadequate insofar as that they fail to take account of their specific needs, about which also very little is known. One mustn't forget that a large number of women in Latin America are being held in prison centers that were designed by and for men. Many of the women are in pavilions that are separate, in detention facilities that were only male, and a separate pavilion was established without taking into account the specific needs of women, about which very little is known, as I say, because so little has been researched in this regard. The failure to address this has been generally justified by saying that women make up a small part of the total prison population. Nonetheless, the growth rate of women in prison has far outstripped that of men in many countries. So there are few women, but their numbers are growing more than the numbers of men are growing. In this context, I think it's very interesting to ask ourselves, well, indeed, there's a need to know who are the women who are locked up in Latin America, what are their characteristics and their particularities. And I'm not sure if you can see all this data, but I'll tell you about it. This is data from a survey that was conducted in 8 Latin American countries in prisons. The prisoners were asked about different things. Here are some of these indicators which reveal that men and women who are locked up are differentiated mainly as regards the criminal conduct that landed them there and the level of social exclusion prior to imprisonment. Women have been involved in less violent crimes, have a shorter criminal record, and generally are accompanied in their actions. Some indicators, for example, as regards criminal conduct, we see that women are mainly in prison for drug charges. 38% of women have been locked up for drugs, and men, that's only 12%. We also see that the percentage is different as to whether or not they had a firearm when the crime was committed. 28% of men did, and this figure is 11% for women. So if we consider a firearm as an indicator of violence, we can see that the crime for which a woman has been sent to prison was carried out with less violence. Now, as regards the criminal history, there are 3 indicators here where one can observe that women have been less recidivist. That is to say, there's a smaller proportion of women who have had a prior conviction, whereas there's 30+% of male recidivists. This is a much smaller percentage in the case of men. For example, the difference is quite large in terms of whether they've ever had firearms. We see that 61% of males did have a firearm at some time, and this is only 26% in the case of women. Basically, these 2 indicators show us that women are locked up for less violent crimes and have a shorter criminal history. They begin their criminal career at a later age. Another interesting indicator is the fact that women commit crimes alone on a more seldom basis. That is to say, more men are locked up, percentage-wise, for crimes they committed alone, whereas women, it's usually accompanied by someone else. It might not be their partner, but there's a 39% of women are detained, or who are detained, well, their companion is, or partner is also locked up. That 39%, but it's only, so 40% of women who are locked up, well, their partner is also locked up. And the literature speaks of a lack of independence of women with relation to a male figure at the time of committing the crime. Also, these indicators show us that the situation of women prior to entering prison is one of greater vulnerability. Before entering prison, a lot of the women are adolescent mothers, and they are in a higher percentage unemployed prior to incarceration, and the indicator is not shown here, but they also larger number of single mothers, and they have more children, and a larger percentage have children. Many of the women who are locked up are mothers, and they were head of household before being locked up. They were in charge of maintaining the family, raising the children. This means that the imprisonment of these women further renders their families all the more vulnerable. There's a the kids are left alone and such, and the family is broken up. So there are economic considerations as well as the social role that is assigned to women in the home. These come into play. What you just mentioned is very interesting, particularly because of showing the risk factors, which are different from those of men in the case of women. So in terms of getting to prison, what do you consider the most important factors, the risk factors, and which are differential with respect to men? Based on this survey, well, we can only see of prison those who have gone to prison. So we don't know why they commit crime. There are issues of recidivism. We can't explain why they commit the crime, but perhaps we can explain why there's recidivism. And there's important differences. For example, for women, the fact of having children is very important. That is to say, the fact of having children increases the likelihood of a woman being recidivist. And this squares with the prior literature, which shows that oftentimes women are engaged in criminal conduct out of economic necessity because of the poverty of their family, the need to take care of their children, and not so much because of other kinds of purposes. It's really a family matter in terms of poverty and the need to keep up the home. When a woman is in prison, what happens to the family? Because it's different when it's the man who's in prison, but it's said that the family ends up disintegrating, falling apart, and the consequences are greater when the woman is in prison. Well, as the data show, many of these women were single mothers, and they were the only ones in charge of maintaining the home, and so their incarceration implies that. A lack of an economic support for the home, and oftentimes the kids are taken to centers, governmental institutions, because of there being no one to take care of and maintain them. Thank you. Now, women also are 20% more likely to be recidivist when they come out of prison. And Carla, you're doing something interesting in Chile. Well, one key aspect is to have programs to help these women when they come out of prison to be able to become reinserted in society, get work, and so forth. Tell us a bit about what you're doing. Well, to tell you a bit about the situation of women in prison, I'd like to share a short video about the situation and the work being done in Chile. So let's take a look at this.
When men are deprived of liberty, their lives continue to work, but
toda la familia se destruye. Trabajar con la mujer.
Working with women is a priority that goes beyond numbers.
Bueno, como podemos
Okay, as we can see, and as Anna was saying, the issue is that when a woman is incarcerated, in a certain way, it's the economic sustainability of the family is also doomed because often she is the head of household. So with regard to the profile of incarcerated women, that's why the IDB has dealt with prisons in both Latin America and the Caribbean and Central America, and we've conducted these surveys because we want to try to determine the profile of these to be able to look at eradication and reintegration into society based on these profiles. So in Chile, we're looking at, we have a program of micro enterprises for women who, after they get out of prison, are able to go back to society and have a business. And this program goes together with a type of therapy which helps to empower women, and all these tools, leadership tools, help them when they get out to have a new self-esteem and profile. And this is being conducted along with the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights of Chile, together with the State Bank of Chile, as Carlos said in his introduction. This is one of the projects that we're conducting in the region to be able to work with incarcerated women. Fine. And another one of the fundamental or sticking points of this issue that the Inter-American Development Bank has viewed as very important is violence against women, which is who are in indigenous or ethnic groups or members of ethnic or indigenous group. There's interesting numbers with this regard in Peru, which is where the case study was conducted on violence against women is practically widespread. Half of women from 15 to 35 years of age have suffered some type of violence during the course of their lives. And to speak more about this issue, and Jorge, you could tell us a bit about what this study was about and explain the most important findings. Yes, I'd gladly. Thank you, Wilson Center, and the IDB, not only for inviting me to be here or allow me to be here with you all, but also to have an opportunity in Washington to speak Spanish. There's not a lot of opportunities to be able to speak Spanish in Washington. So thank you very much. So all my notes are in English, and so I'm going to do my simultaneous interpreting myself. Peru is an interesting country. It's interesting not only because the high violence rates with regard to violence against women from their partners, perpetrated by partners, but there's a huge effort that's been made to try to measure and coordinate policies. But it's obviously a multi-ethnic country. So we must try to understand how, through the different ethnic groups, could there be different violence rates, and can there be public policies that are focused specifically on the most vulnerable populations? This is an interesting, important, and worthwhile decision to make. Peru has done this because the study, which is quantitative in nature, of course, Peru also has, since 2003, has surveys right up to the current date, year after year it's been conducting, where cross-sections of the nationally from 15 to 49 years of age, questions have been asked about these issues. But the study worked from 2003 to 2012, where it's pretty homogeneous questionnaires to try to address this. Peru is interesting because it's a representative sampling. It's more than 70,000 women in the analysis, which allows a pretty overall picture of the country. One. Two, though, through this survey, we can measure physical and emotional and sexual violence. And three, I'd like to point out that there's policies that have been put into place that have tried to address this problem. Ethnic origin in Peru is a complicated matter. And Vargas Llosa, who won the Nobel Prize, he says it's got every ethnic group possible. And so there's a growing literature in Peru, and the advantage was taken of this to try to theorize or identify ethnically of the groups of people using linguistic groups. So there's three. One is women who grew up and continue to speak an indigenous language, Quechua or Aymara, for example. And then all women in the study, in the literature, grew up speaking Spanish, and they continue to speak Spanish. That's the second group. And the third group of women are women who have just recently acquired Spanish. They grew up speaking a language other than Spanish, but now they use it. And if you look at these three groups, socioeconomically, there's a very clear-cut difference between these three groups. The women who are indigenous have lower socioeconomic levels. The recent Spanish speakers, a little higher, and then at the top are those who spoke Spanish from the time they were born. So this socioeconomic hierarchy does not translate into the violence rates. It's not the indigenous women who have the higher one, but the recent Spanish speakers have the highest violence rates. And this is consistent over time. This is consistent aside from how you look at the types of violence. And so one would ask, why does it vary in this way? If socioeconomically, the lowest ones don't have the highest violence levels. So what we tried to do, I'm an economist, remember, so I don't feel too bad. I feel bad about that sometimes. But with this, from the economic point of view, that violence in the home usually is dealt with negotiation. And so the theory shows that power in the whole household is determined by your options outside of your marriage. So if you have options, better options outside, you have higher, better bargaining chip in negotiation. But if you don't have much power outside, your options outside of your marriage, so relative to your partner, then that's when you don't have a good bargaining position. So women who speak Spanish from a young age, since they were born, marry people who have the same conditions. Indigenous people marry people who socioeconomically are similar to them, but the women who have recently acquired Spanish don't. They marry people who have higher socioeconomic levels and higher educational level of their partner than these women who just learned Spanish later in their life. This having a relative level with respect to your partner of worse options outside of your marriage ends up explaining or accounts for this difference of violence rates. So these are women who immigrate. They left the rural sector, these women who recently acquired Spanish, and they've gotten, and so we can get into the policies we could talk about that address this, but that's my answer. So there's one thing that you mentioned, the range of possibilities or opportunities that women would have and how this has a bearing and being a victim of violence when they have no possibilities to work or develop, women, that is. So they lose bargaining power in their family unit. How does not having any possibilities affect violence? It's a good question. How does this inability to have any possibilities outside? The idea is that the thing that's of interest is that the options that a person may have on the labor market, for example, what I tried to push forward a bit is that's not the only thing that's important, but what's important is relative to their partner. So indigenous women have lower socioeconomic levels, fewer opportunities in the workforce, and they earn less, but their partners are very similar. So with regard to bargaining chip in the household, she's not at a disadvantage in negotiations with her partner. But women who recently acquired Spanish, who migrated to the cities and left their communities and have lost their support networks, their family support, because they no longer live where their family is from, where they grew up. They have a partner often who has different socioeconomic profiles and usually is a higher level. So their bargaining chip, their ability to negotiate is not favorable to them. They're at a disadvantage. And so this has a consequence with regard to policy design. Peru is one of the few countries in the region that has, for 20 more years, it has a ministry of women. A ministry of women which receives more and more resources over time. It's a country also where policies are established. There's a national program. There are policies in place, and clear effort is made to improve the situation. And some of these efforts go hand in hand with IDB sponsored programs. The question that's interesting to me is that it's vulnerable or more vulnerable women because of their ethnic background and those are the ones who have recently acquired Spanish. What consequences do they have how does this affect policy design? Well, first of all, not a lot of emphasis is put on policies based on geography. So these women aren't necessarily located in the rural sector, but in smaller, medium, or large-sized cities. So we shouldn't base policies on geography. So the rural strategy is one thing. Even though it is important, it is not a way to address the problems of women who are the most vulnerable. Two, that's the first thing. The second thing is the ministry manages more than 200 women emergency centers. These are centers that try to provide health assistance mainly to women who are in situations or have suffered violent situations. These women's emergency centers do record ethnic background, but it don't do it as the study does in the same way. So when women self-define themselves as mestizos or indigenous, 80%, for example, of the women are mestizas, and it doesn't allow you to break it down to get to the fine points to see who are the mestizas who are recently acquired Spanish language skills, etc. It doesn't allow you to break it down that far. And furthermore, the ministry manages several programs. In 2016, this is the last year I have information for, the ministry conducted 34,000 activities, nearly 34,000 activities nationwide dealing with different preventive measures or palliative measures as with regard to violence against women. 39, not 39,000, just 39 of the 34,000 activities, 39 of these are exclusively with men. So this imbalance, I would say, it does cause a problem in a country that has a clear-cut decision to put policies into place. Brings us back to the issue, speaking about evidence and how to generate evidence-based policies. How did this happen if the most vulnerable population aren't necessarily the ones that are in certain geographic areas? They're the migrants to the cities. So the strategy has to be much more effective to get to them. Jorge, also I wanted to know, this study was conducted in Peru, but it's possible in many ethnic groups throughout Latin America, which is a region that's rich in ethnic groups, may be experiencing the same thing. And the most important thing may be that they're not located in the same areas as what you're saying, in the areas where the resources have been focused from the government, and there's not men aren't being involved. So is it important in Peru and other countries it's important to have a ministry of women and to appoint women to high-level positions in the armed forces of the country and throughout the government? Would you say it's necessary that these resources be used for education of men as well? What do you say it's more important? At the center of the problem is the political decision to be able to do this. That's what's at the center of this problem. The ironies of life. Peru, even though it has the Ministry of Women in the government, it was under Fujimori's, ironically enough, under President Fujimori. That was the area where Fujimori is when he goes to Beijing, Fujimori did, and as a result, he creates this Ministry of Women. But part of the reason why Peru does all of this is because it has pushed forward legislation on this topic. Femicide doesn't exist as a crime on the books and throughout the country, even where it exists, and it has to be measured. And this is a place where there's a lot of femicide, but it's being measured more now. But the interesting thing is that there's a prerequisite, is the political decision has to be taken to work on these issues. And this political decision hasn't been taken throughout all the countries. To what extent can the study be expanded and allow us to understand, grasp this problem in other countries? Well, what the study proposes, when you think about these decisions and these situations, what at the core of the problem is the disparity of the dynamic of power within couples. So we looked at indigenous women, the women who were raised in Spanish, they marry with people who are similar. If in Ecuador that's not the same case, or in Guatemala that isn't the case, then the solution's going to be different. So in my view, you have to look at context, and we have to look at these dynamics of power are the same as it is in Peru. Likely it's not the case. And so this would mean that there'd be different rankings than what's found in Peru. Karelia, you all have been working at the bank in pilot projects specifically to deal with these issues and how to empower women to avoid, among different ethnic groups and minorities, how to empower them. Yes, precisely. In Peru, we worked on a microcredit program for women who belong to ethnic groups, Sumacuarmi ethnic group, which Jorge is very familiar with. And we gave microcredits for these women to have sustainability throughout their work professional development. But it's important to support these women with regard to access to justice. The bank is also working heavily in countries such as Guatemala and gathering evidence in countries like Mexico with regard to how these access to justice centers work for women. Access to justice centers where there's intervention of prosecutors, law enforcement, health sector, and in the same place, immediate care and assistance is provided to victims of intrafamily violence and other types of violence, and to children in the region. So in Guatemala, for example, we're working with a ministry, the Office of the Prosecutor, to provide these services to other communities, like in Alta Verapaz, Guatemala. In Mexico, there was documented through the Wilson Center, a document which is part of this study, talks about how justice centers in Mexico, Honduras, as a matter of fact, a new project which is approved in April, are very much focused on how to strengthen services provided by the police as well as the prosecutor's office with an adequate training of the staff that must be specialized and in a differential way. It's got to be differentiated to deal with this particular type of victims and meet the health requirements, immediate health requirements of these people, these women and children. And so it's been proven. There's been good results that have been yielded with regard to complaints filed by women with regard to violence against women at these centers. And this is one of the different interventions that the bank has been in pilot projects with its loans it has been supporting. Now, we've been talking about projects and promotion programs and public policies as well to counter violence against women, but you have to look at the root of the problem and start at early age, how children, males and females, have to be educated to prevent these patterns of violence from happening in the future. Why do children tend to be victims of forms of violence? And Anna, perhaps you can give us a broad view of this, a more broad view. We conducted a second part of the investigation, continuing with the other surveys. We tried to explore it and to quite explain that the influence on kids and their future conduct as adults. What we've seen is in the literature, and the evidence has shown different forms of violence, but there's direct violence where the victim, and direct and indirect from the parents themselves. The indirect violence would mean it's like witnessing, when the child witnesses violence of his or her parents. So if they're a witness, they're victims because they're immersed in a context of violence in their household, even though it's not directed towards the child. but they're considered a victim, and they can be victim in two ways of violence. It could be direct or indirect. We have to realize that. And what we tried to do in this second part was to try to explore to what extent these forms of violence, direct and indirect, have a influence or have a bearing on criminal conduct in the future, and between women or males and females. Talking about the profiles of women, women seem to be affected by both direct and indirect types of violence. In other words, it has an influence in a more harmful way on women. Both ways have a bearing on their subsequent criminal behavior. And on the other hand, males, only direct violence seems to affect them. The fact that they were hit when they were children, it seems to have a greater bearing in the future and criminal. But with women, both direct and indirect violence do have an effect on their future criminal behavior when they've experienced this as little girls. Affects women much more. Women are much more, girls are much more vulnerable or susceptible to this. Now, in general terms, what's been shown, that there must be an intervention, therefore, from the time that of these children, not later when they get into prison. And we have to intervene early, because this type of violence affects both males and females. But as I said, it's much more harmful to women. Now we've heard from all the panelists, but we want to hear everybody's here. It's very relevant of violence against women. Eric, we were talking about direct and indirect violence, but often it's difficult to distinguish between psychological and physical violence, and particularly for authorities to intervene when it's about psychological violence, because there's a pattern. And that it end up culminate in physical violence. What do you think are the most important things to take into account from the point of view of the state and authorities with regards to the different types of violence, and that there's intergenerational transmission of it? Yes, thank you. I believe that one of the things that excites me quite a bit about all these studies is that we're learning more in depth about the dynamics of intrafamily, intrafamily violence, and how this experience takes place over time. I just came back from the elections in Mexico, and one of the major issues that was brought up is obviously corruption, but the issue of violence. Mexico is experiencing a time of such high levels of violence, and there's a demand by the public for greater security and certainty and safe places. So a lot of times people say we have to throw them in jail, the capos and the drug things. But what Jorge has done, and Anna's study and her team, etc., we have to understand the right roots of this violence. It's not just about, you can't just throw in jail people who have committed crimes as adults. But what we have to do as well is seek out and come up with what the roots are for this criminal behavior. And it's not just experience of direct violence, but indirect violence as well. We have to view this as a state, and those who are trying to influence policymakers. We have to bring about responses of the state based on this knowledge and evidence and all the things we're talking about and thinking about here. There's a fifth study. We've talked about 4 studies here. 2 presented by Ana, Jorge's study, and the one mentioned just now by Carelia in Mexico, the Emergency Centers for Women. But there's a Haiti-based study as well in this group of studies, where we are planning, or what we're trying to do is deal with the issue of violence against children and women, but in a community context. There is a community intervention, not just at the individual level, which is very important, but in the context of the community as a whole. How to rethink the ideas of masculinity and maleness in a specific community. And I believe all of these issues must be taken into to be taken into account in design of public policies. We all want greater security. It's a logical demand, a legitimate demand of the people. But the solutions to these problems are very often are much more complex and must be in line with the different experiences and how the woman or the child experiences them, and how the male, the young man or man. So there has to be different approaches. Now, in the range of studies and analyses that you conducted in Peru, what would you say are the most significant and meaningful aspects of the violence, intergenerational violence, or the violence suffered by children or in indigenous groups? How were you able to see this area in the study in Peru? Now, the study is quite accurate, it's quite precise. It has a precise scope. It didn't necessarily work per se on that. So there should be another. But with Martín Benavides in Peru, another study, and quite a bit of my work with violence against women has been together with the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. But with Martín, what we did was thinking about intergenerational transmission of violence, that the persons who have grown up in violent households have a greater propensity to become partners with others that are similarly. I'm going to use, it's sort of like the marriage market. It tells a lot about and pardon the economic language, but it talks about the set of possibilities or options that a couple has after growing up in a violent household. Now, if they grow up in a violent household, there's much greater possibility or a likelihood that if she came from that my options in the market aren't very great. They're very restricted as far as the marriage market, so to speak. So when there's no global market, so to speak, to look for a partner. So this facilitates this paves the way for intergenerational violence, transmission of violence, that is. So what I'm saying is that what we've seen using economic terms, again, technology to fight against conflict. There's two technologies. One is by beating. The other is talking and taking a break, time out. So when there's the only technology I know to deal with conflict is beatings. That's what a lot of these people think. So with Martín, with my partner, his technology is that. That's what he uses. And so when we get together, there's only one technology that we use, and that's going to be conveyed. It's going to be transmitted down because my children see this, and my father is using this technology. He disagrees, my father, and the kids are seeing this, and the way he solves it is that's the only way, is by smacking her or yelling or insulting her. Invective. So this issue of the marriage market, which we use in Martín's and in the ethnic study, it's to the extent that you can broaden the market, expand the market, and that how you grew up and how you were raised, that is no longer so determinative of who you're going to marry. So it was mentioned that it was important, but in some households that aren't as fortunate as Erica, as Erica was saying, you don't have that technology of beating. So it's important to be able to learn that beating is not the way, independently of where you were born in. So that must be understood. What we were saying, the roots of the problem have to be understood, and the things that I've been researching. It has a lot to do with who you pair up with. And there's certain things in the the market that don't allow better interaction.
Now, looking at the context in which these children grow up, boys and girls, and the importance of transmission of violence, Honduras has one of the highest rates of violence against women and girls who are growing up with major pressures on the part of gangs, criminals. The children, the girls tend to be the victim not only of psychological violence, but also physical violence and sexual violence. Carla, what are you doing from the standpoint of the bank, or Carelia? How are you supporting projects in Honduras? Well, thank you. In addition to projects, it's very important to generate knowledge and to be able to understand why it is that these relationships take place. Indeed, through the Honduras project, we work on a study to understand whether there's a correlation between marginal areas and family violence. And we discovered in this study that there is indeed a positive correlation between marginal areas and family violence. We still need to go further in this study to try to figure out the causal relationship, but some of the hypotheses are that it has to do with the absence of the state in these areas. For example, there are no services such as policing services or prevention programs or programs for empowering women. And what Jorge mentioned, try to change this technology, switch out the chip, whereby so that problems can be resolved in different ways, empowering people. Through a program in Honduras in these areas, we're trying to geographically situate, using the study, where services need to go. For example, police services, prosecutorial services, health, and so on. They have this integrated model in Honduras, and to be able to strengthen it with social programs to prevent violence, which are also very important in addition to the services of control and being able to actually prosecute crimes. As Eric was saying, it's important to also bring positive views of masculinity or maleness, so as to be able to move beyond some of the deeply rooted patterns in our cultures, and also strengthen women through micro-entrepreneurship programs, so as to be able to supplement the programs with greater sustainability. And this is among the social projects being implemented through this project, which is about to get off the ground. Now, having looked at these different aspects of what is happening, different aspects such as women in prison, women from different ethnic groups. The question is what to do. How should these policies be directed? Where should resources go? What should the states do, the states of the region, to be able to avoid the propagation of this considerable problem? What could these good practices be that could be implemented to prevent family violence? What are the policies that could be adopted to provide services to the survivors of such violence as well? Well, I think we've said quite a bit so far, but I think it's a question of designing specific policies based on the knowledge and evidence that has been created in these studies and in many others that have to do with, well, that are designed specifically bearing in mind family dynamics, first of all, and the difference whereby a girl or a young woman's direct and indirect experience with violence, or the young man or the boy fleshing out what their own experience with direct violence has been. I think if we have a differentiated, gender-differentiated perspective is extremely important. Jorge also mentioned this question of the power relationship that exists between a recent Spanish-speaking woman and her a partner from another economic level. We need to have public policies that answer to the situation of women in such contexts, but also that work with the men. They're two sides of the same coin. And so we need to begin to design public policies specifically along these lines for them. I like very much what Carelia mentioned and the study that was done in Mexico on the Women's Justice Center, because it offers, under a single roof, several services. A woman who lives in a context of violence and steps out of this context shouldn't have to also confront such a complex bureaucracy. So they're all under a single roof. She can seek out the support of the prosecutor's office. She can file a legal complaint. But she can also have her medical and psychological needs addressed, and economic needs. We also need to recognize that in that context of violence, where a woman leaves her home, well, she's going to be in a situation of quite a bit of vulnerability, economic vulnerability as well. And I believe that that approach to facilitate women's access to public services under a single roof is also a policy that we should study more closely. But we should also think about how to reproduce these elsewhere. Now, how does Latin America stand? How does the region stand compared to other parts of the world in respect of implementing these policies? Because quite a bit of progress has been made in the last 2 decades. Ministry of Women's Affairs are being created. Spaces are being established for women to hold high-level positions. But where does the region stand in relation to these policies for reducing violence against women? I don't know. I think Carelia is the one who is most knowledgeable of this issue. Well, I do think it's very important to continue working with, especially if we have the political will of the countries that want to adopt such prevention, attention, and policies to eradicate violence against women. But we have the major lack of information in the region. Indeed, it's very difficult to be able to compare femicide situation in the region among countries. There are no up-to-date statistics. As Jorge mentioned, Peru may be one of the few countries that has a criminal statute on femicide. We find that sometimes the whole question of the crime of violence against women in the family violence, is not well identified in the countries. There's an example where a woman who has suffered violence once has to suffer it a second time before it can be considered a crime that can be pursued by the authorities. I think that we need to have solid legal frameworks as a means of preventing this form of violence in the various countries. And obviously the question of information, as was mentioned, that is very much necessary. Indeed, we could mention the example of Mexico. Mexico approached the Inter-American Development Bank to seek support for being able to consolidate, even if it's just in a database, to consolidate databases, not to produce more data, because Mexico produces quite a bit of information and sometimes it's watered down. And so we sometimes have a hard time figuring out just what are the indicators, what are the states and the municipalities that have the highest prevalence of this kind of a crime. And through the bank, a platform was put together. It's going to be launched next month, where these statistics are identified, analyses can be drawn up, and it's also a point of reference for figuring out where state services are situated. If a woman victim of violence wants to pursue such services, for example, it also includes a new tool which is called web mining. What is being said on social networks? How can one find out more who is looking for information about violence against women, so as to be able to detect those geographic regions with the greatest prevalence of or hardest hit by this type of violence. The platform is going to be launched in August, and I think it's very important to have robust, solid information so as to be able to really target interventions so that this can generate more value added. It's very important to know where to locate the interventions, as Jorge was saying, to be able to know the profiles of such victims, so as to be able to carry out interventions that are more cost efficient and more appropriate to combat this type of violence. And this panel that we have, well, we have very few opportunities to talk about such an important issue. We would also like to invite the public to share any concerns with us. If you have any questions for a particular panelist, you can raise your hand, and a microphone will be brought to you. So we have one question right here in the center. Hello, I'm Missy Wright from the Inter-American Dialogue, and I have a question more for Carelia, but everyone can speak to it. There's been quite a bit of talk about creating better conditions for women to fight violence, such as women's police stations, health services, and so forth. For example, in Brazil, since the 1980s, they already have the Delegacia da Mulher, the Maria da Penha law, which dates to 2006, but they're not implemented. So what can we do to confirm and reinforce the notion that in those countries where they have such services, to make sure that they're actually carried out and made available to women? I think that one important element is being able to involve civil society in such measures, involve civil society also from technical proposals, evaluations. It's important to be able to evaluate the already existing interventions, because we have found this to be an effective tool when it comes to being able to talk about information on a solid foundation, so as to be able to approach governments and seek the continuation of certain policies, or to be able to actually effectively implement them and show them they're not working as they should be. I think this is another important element where there's plenty to be done. We need to carry out qualitative and quantitative studies on such interventions. Another question right up here, up front. Good morning, Jessica Levante from ProMujer. I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to know, and this is an open question for whoever might be able to help me out with it, the relationship between women's economic empowerment and a higher incidence of domestic violence. I'm trying to find studies or reports, data on this question, and I'm not finding much. So I don't know if you, the researchers in particular, could help guide me or let me know if you know of any kind of study that is pulling together this kind of information. So that's it. Oftentimes, we provide women, for example, microcredits, activities to enhance their economic independence. And when they come home, for whatever reason, the man doesn't like the idea that she's earning more money, that she's leaving the home to get training, to be able to start up her own business or what have you, and then begins to beat the woman. Anecdotally, we find in some projects that afterwards the man realizes that what the woman wants is to do good for the family, and then helps her and joins the business. But this after beating her for who knows how long. So I would appreciate any guidance from you in this regard. Anyone wish to field that question? Jorge, please. It depends on how you define economic empowerment, but there are several studies that have looked at the effect of receiving conditioned financing, or along the lines of Progressa. I don't know what the new name of Progressa is, or something like the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil. There's extensive literature on this. And if you'd like, we could discuss that later on. Carelia already mentioned the work that we did in Sumaguarmi and Ayacucho in Peru, which in one way or another tries to go forward with what had been done in South Africa, providing microcredit to rural women. It depends on how you define it, but there are several studies, and we can talk about that afterwards if you'd like. There is quite a bit of literature in Argentina. I've undertaken a study on psychological violence, not so much in terms of input, but the more education women have, the more the greater the possibility that they would be suffering psychological violence from their partner. This could be an indicator of economic empowerment, but when I give class on this topic, I often note that many times women's empowerment, quote unquote, makes them become victims of violence, and therefore they shouldn't be empowered because it's going to have negative repercussions. But there are also studies that show that the more greater empowerment there is, the easier it is to escape from the situation. So while there might be a greater proclivity to suffering violence, they're also going to have the tools to escape, and have the tools for that. Very well, we have time for one more question. Catalina Casas from the Latin American program. This is a question for everyone, but perhaps particularly for Jorge and Eric. How can men become more involved? Because clearly, this struggle cannot be waged by women alone. So how can men get more involved in battling machismo at the root, say, so as to be able to attack these problems from both sides? Give the floor to Eric, and we'll conclude with Jorge. Well, that wasn't the focus of the studies, so I'm a bit logically, I'm thinking about this question, and part of this, and this was also mentioned by Erica, this has to begin from childhood. That is to say, the child rearing and relations between boys and girls in the family, well, it needs to start from there, because we know that many attitudes and behaviors going forward are defined there. So I think that in essence, this is a task that corresponds not only to the family and the home, but also the educational system. There is a study from Haiti that shows how important community context is and how this impacts definitions of masculinity. It's extremely important, and the experience of this project, which is called SASA, in Uganda first and later in Haiti, well, the challenge was, how do you take up a conversation with the community about these issues to get a change in view with respect to violence against women, how acceptable it is, and how those cultural norms need to change, and those cultural attitudes need to change in the community. So what I can conclude from all of this is that one must begin from an early age. It's the only, well, it's the best option. And then there are things that can be done for adults going forward. For example, the programs in Peru, maybe they could be a little more targeted in contexts of vulnerability. But in terms of your question, the focus should be early age, family, community, and cultural context. And Jorge, briefly, your closing comment. As Eric said, the study didn't involve looking at that, but it's not as though I've not thought about it. Quite to the contrary. A lot of my research areas involve thinking along those lines. And there are two or three things. First, while there is an early childhood question, in many cases, physical violence and emotional violence through insults and offensive language are gut reactions. And it involves not being able to control that impetus. And so the question is, what could help you or facilitate you controlling that impetus? Once again, it's very important to read in several fields of study. Economics has one possible way of looking at this, and others fields of knowledge as well. So if I don't have the technology for changing how I deal with it, if the only thing I know about dealing with conflict is to shout, then it's going to be very difficult to change that behavior. Going back to what Erica was saying, and she is talking about an example where that transmission was done. Now, what if you don't have the good fortune to grow up in a home such as Erica did? What are the other ways of dealing with this? Well, obviously, one involves early childhood interventions. Peru has tried, and I say tried because there's an ideological and a heavy ideological and political debate having to do with how boys and girls in public schools are taught to discuss gender equality in Peru. That's complicated because every time that happens, they try to get rid of the minister. So dealing with this, politically speaking, is difficult. That first. Second, there are campaigns, Erica said it if I'm not mistaken, where one looks at violence against women not just as something to be dealt with in a health campaign, but I think we need to think of it from this and approach it from this angle. It can do a lot can be done. People smoke much less than they smoked before. For example, people in Peru, according to the surveys, well, there's practically universal knowledge and access to modern contraceptive methods. Now, there have been public policies that have been successful to change what we could call cultural patterns. Rates of violence against children, the use of corporal punishment for dealing with conflicts with children is much less today than when I was brought up. So looking up to what point certain policies have been effective, going back to the topic that has brought us together here, we want to have evidence-based policies. So how can you deal with this? Education, well, that's good, but there's also a political debate involved. I already mentioned this in relation to Peru. Now, imagine I'm 28 years old. I'm no longer in school. What is the policy? I'm not going to go back to school. How could access to alternative technologies for dealing with conflict be provided? And there are interesting possibilities. There's the use of television. There's a work that's been done by a professor at the University of Maryland, not far from here, that shows that adolescent pregnancy rates have fallen in the wake of an MTV program called 16 and Pregnant. There's evidence in Brazil that the use of contraceptive methods declines as Globo has expanded in the country. Likewise in India. Now, if the theory is, well, I didn't grow up with this technology or in a home like Erica did, so there are ways that one can think of, thinking about alternative experiences, whereby this technology could be provided. And it involves not only discussions at school, which apparently is politically complex. Meetings such as this are important for that very purpose, to be able to say there are certain theories that we could put to the test. Let's go here, let's go there. Perhaps stepping in to change the curriculum in Peru is extremely complicated at this time because civil society doesn't want or cannot organize itself to deal with this because groups on one side or the other side are too strong. Not one less in Peru and Argentina, these programs are important. It's a way civil society says it's enough now. That's sick and tired of it, and I'm going to demonstrate. And then demonstrating once a year is one thing. Carrying that over into political discussions is another. But discussions in academia and public fora, such as this, with the dialogue and the IDB, we can begin to find successful programs, be it in early childhood or further along. And what I would be looking at would be those areas most interesting for research. We'll close out this discussion that the Wilson Center and the IDB have provided a forum for. I'd like to give Eric the floor to close out. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Diana, who has been a moderator this morning. Thank you very much. We were very happy to receive all of you here at our house, the Wilson Center. And as they say in Mexico, this is your house as well. You're always welcome. I would like to thank and recognize some people who have been with us not only this morning, but throughout this process. Friends from the IDB, Robert Panzer, who I think is no longer here. Ah, yes, he is. Thank you, Robert. Denise Wilkinson, who was a part of this. I don't know if she is here, working at Pan American Health Organization now, but was played a very important role in this process. And our dear friend, Mauricio Bastier, who was also with us, but is now in Honduras. I don't know if he's accompanying us on the internet, but Mauricio played an integral part in this effort as well. So I would like to thank him. I'd also like to thank my colleagues from the Wilson Center, Gwen Young, who you already met. She has a lengthy experience working on these issues in Africa, and I'd like to thank her for her participation. Jacqueline Dolasal, who helped us with the publication of the documents, and our volunteers, Jessica Tuller, Sam, and others who are with us. I would also like to acknowledge the excellent work of the interpreters, Charlie Roberts and David Sperling in the back, and our AV team.
Assistance. Esto ha sido grabado. Lo vamos a
This has been taped. We will recorded. We will be putting it up again by the end of today. You'll be able to look at it again, and hopefully it'll go around through the social media as well. I'd like to thank the IDB, Carelia, the whole team, and the researchers who have been with us throughout this process. And thank you all for having accompanied us. And this is the end of the discussion, but you can continue on social media, as Eric said, on the 2 Twitter accounts that the IDB has, BID Security and the Wilson Center Latin Prog. Thank you.